The judge's gavel hits the desk with a resounding bang. You stand there in utter disbelief. You can't understand what just happened. Thoughts form into your mind. Is this real? Just then reality hits you. You have been sentenced to death. You scream, "Wait, I didn't do anything, I'm innocent." This is reality for roughly 10% of inmates on death row today. I believe we need to give DNA testing for all death row inmates. In the U.S., as of June 2002, 108 people, including 12 death row inmates, have been exonerated by use of DNA tests. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, the increasing use of DNA testing to help confirm the innocence on guilt in capital cases is one among many reforms that will help ensure that innocent people are not sentenced to death. The Innocence Project states that there have been 245 post-conviction DNA exonerations in United States history. These stories are becoming more familiar as more innocent people gain their freedom through post-conviction testing. 17 people have been sentenced to death before DNA proved their innocence. The average sentence served by DNA exonerees has been 13 years. About 70% of these exonerated by DNA are members of minority groups. Exonerations have been won in 34 states. The Death Penalty Information Center says, in a 5-4 ruling on June 18th, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed a lower federal court ruling, holding that due process clause of the 14th Amendment guarantees a convicted inmate the right to a DNA test on evidence that might prove his innocence. An example of this is the case of William Osborne, who had been convicted in 1994 of sexual assault in Alaska and sentenced to 26 years in prison. Alaska is one of only 4 states in the country that does not have a law providing for access to DNA evidence. Osborne was willing to pay for the test, which the state admitted might have conclusively proved his guilt or innocence. Justice John Paul Stevens wrote 4 dissenters stating that the liberty interest at stake for Osborne was more important and fundamental than the minor inconvenience for the state to allow the testing. The DNA that Osborne seeks is a simple one. It's cost modest, and its results uniquely precise. Yet, for reasons the state has been unable or unwilling to articulate, it refuses to allow Osborne to test the evidence at his own expense and to thereby ascertain the truth once and for all. He concludes, there is no reason to deny access to the evidence, and there are many reasons to provide it, not least of which is a fundamental concern in ensuring that justice has been done in this case. According to Equal Justice Initiative, Alabama lawmakers recently passed a new law that requires the state to collect DNA samples from everyone who is arrested for a felony, including children. This law also restricts access to DNA testing for people convicted of a capital offense and reduces the opportunity for a wrongfully convicted person to prove his innocence. Through DNA evidence, the Alabama law does not allow DNA testing in any case where some DNA testing was done previously, even if the earlier testing was inconclusive, botched, or used an outdated technique. The law imposes strict time limits on an incarcerated person to request DNA testing and requires the filing of a detailed legal pleading. Because Alabama does not provide legal help to people on death row, these requirements will be impossible to meet for most death row prisoners. North Carolina death row inmate Daryl Hunt was exonerated after state-of-the-art DNA testing proved that someone else committed the crime for which he was convicted and sentenced to death. Because DNA evidence from the case was tested earlier, Alabama's law would have barred Mr. Hunt from the DNA testing that exonerated him and identified the actual perpetrator, even though the earlier tests were based on outmoded technology and produced inconclusive results. I think that executions must stop until all convictions are carefully reviewed to ensure there are no innocent persons on death row. American Civil Liberties Union Death Penalty Information Center, National Center for Policy Analysis, and the National Coalition to Abolish Death Penalty says that on January 31st, Illinois' Governor George Ryan, a death penalty supporter, put a hold on executions in the state after 13 inmates on death row had their convictions overturned. Since 1977, Illinois has had 13 overturned convictions and 12 executions. They have set free more death row inmates than is executed. With numbers like that, there's little doubt that Illinois and other states have wrongfully executed many innocent people. How did innocents end up on death row? Bad legal representation due to lawyers who have never tried a capital case or show up in court drunk. Others are wrongfully convicted for lack of DNA evidence or corrupt witnesses. In Alabama, Judy Hanley was convicted of murder and sentenced to death even though one of her lawyers came to court drunk. In Chicago, Rolando Cruz was sentenced to death for the rape and murder of a 10-year-old girl even though another man confessed to the crime. After 10 years, Cruz was set free thanks partly to DNA evidence. In the last 3 decades, 1,004 people have been executed in the United States. And there is critical DNA evidence in many of those cases that has never been tested. 39 people have been executed so far this year in the U.S., including 19 in Texas. There are 15 more executions scheduled in Texas between now and August 31st, including 7 in June alone. Since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, 637 people have been put to death nationwide. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, 87 inmates since 1973 have been exonerated and have been taken off death row, as many as a result of DNA testing. In conclusion, for the sake of victims, the wrongly accused, law enforcement officials, and the public at large, our criminal justice system must be based on finding the truth. DNA testing can provide certainty in many cases because it can confirm guilt or demonstrate innocence or help identify the true perpetrators. Thank you.
All right, Deshaun, what did you think?
I didn't know if there was like a structured preview, and she said a preview, and there wasn't really that much transitions or signposting. Her eye contact was a little bit limited in between, kind of like she was just reading, but the conclusion was very clear and it was pretty good.
All right. Yeah, I have a few of the same issues. I like the visualization that you have at the beginning, and you've got a very clear goal that you've got set up, but the content is not structured for us very clearly, and during the speech it really seems sometimes like you were moving from one topic to another. There's an argument about the validity of the DNA, there's a problem with the states who have laws that restrict the use of DNA or that don't necessarily require the use, although it did sound at one point like most of the states do require the use of DNA, so that was a little bit confusing. And then the next thing I know, I'm hearing death penalty arguments, and I think that there's some confusion involved. I don't know, for instance, that the one woman who's convicted, despite her lawyer being drunk, was a DNA case, so I think you're kind of mixing the issues there. I think the DNA stuff is the very solid part of the argument where you develop issues pretty effectively. There's a lot of information from the groups that you were citing that I thought was pretty effective, but I did think that you kind of piled through that data very quickly, and it seemed like it was, here's a statistic, here's a statistic, here's an example, here's some stuff, and I wasn't always sure what inferences you wanted us to draw from that, and I think that needed to be structured a little bit more. The presentation is, I think vocally it was pretty solid. Your eye contact, there is quite a bit of reading, but you seem natural when you were speaking up there with your gestures. I just think that you want to be more engaged with the audience. All right, thank you.